Good Sunday morning and welcome to Coffee and Clarity. I'm Stephen Briggs and I'm grateful that you're here. Maybe you're drinking your first cup of coffee, maybe you're getting ready for church, or maybe you're just driving across town. Or even still, maybe you're just trying to start the day a little slower than the rest of the week usually allows. However you're joining me this morning, I'm glad you're here. Each week on Coffee and Clarity, we take a few minutes to slow down, think clearly, and get your mind ready for the week ahead. We talk about leadership, we talk about mindset, we talk about business, we talk about life. But really, this time is about creating space to think. Because most of us don't need more noise, right? We have plenty of that. What we need is a little room to notice what's been going on in our own thinking. You're listening to the Coffee and Clarity Show with Stephen Briggs. Real conversations, practical growth, and stronger leaders. Each week, we spend a little time talking about mindset and leadership, personal growth, and the thinking that quietly shapes the way that we live and lead. Today, you're listening to Resilient Mindset, Building Your Default. I like Sunday mornings because they give us a natural place to pause. The week hasn't fully started yet. Monday isn't here asking for answers. The phone might be a little quieter, and the calendar might not be pulling quite as hard. And even if life is still busy, Sunday has a way of giving us a moment to breathe before everything starts moving again. And I think we need that, because during the week, most of us spend a lot of time reacting. Something changes, somebody needs an answer, a conversation doesn't go the way that we thought it would. An email comes in, or a delay throws off the plan, or even a problem shows up that we weren't expecting. And before long, we're just moving from one thing to the next. We're handling it, we're answering it, we're fixing it, right? We're adjusting to it, but every now and then something happens that does more than interrupt our schedule. It reveals something in us. One comment can do that. One look, one email, one unexpected change. And all of a sudden our mind goes somewhere fast. Maybe we get frustrated. Maybe we get defensive. Maybe we start assuming the worst or shut down, right? Or start replaying an old story that we've told ourselves before. And sometimes the reaction shows up so quickly that we don't even question it. We just think that's how I am. I'm just impatient. I just overthink things. I just don't handle pressure well. I've always been this way. But I want to slow that down this morning, because what if that first response isn't the whole truth about who you are? What if it's a pattern? What if it's something that your mind has practiced? What if it's been shaped over time by repeated thoughts and repeated expectations and repeated ways of interpreting what's happening around you? That's what I want to sit with today. The way that we respond under pressure often shows us something deeper than the pressure itself. It shows us what we've been thinking, what we've been believing, right? What we've been rehearsing. And if we can notice that without immediately judging it or excusing it, we can begin to grow. And so here's the question that I want us to carry into the conversation this morning. When something happens this week, when something interrupts you, or when something frustrates you, when something doesn't go the way that you expected, what is your first response trying to tell you? Not just about the situation, but about your thinking, about your expectations, about the story that your mind has been repeating. Because sometimes clarity starts with one honest question. Why did I respond that way? Most of us can replay what happened pretty easily, right? The conversation, the email, the delay that bothered us, the comment somebody made, the thing that we thought should have gone differently. Those details usually aren't hard to remember, but remembering what happened is not the same as understanding what's going on the inside of us. And that's the part that I want to slow down with, because we all had moments where our response got our attention. Maybe your tone changed quicker than you expected. Maybe you said something and thought later, that came out stronger than I meant it to. Maybe you shut down. Maybe you acted like you were fine, but you carried the frustration with you for the next 3 hours. Sometimes it isn't even a big moment. It might be one comment, one change in plans, one text, one request that you weren't expecting. And before you know it, your mind is already moving, and you start assuming what someone meant. And so you start replaying the conversation, and you start preparing for a conversation that hasn't even happened yet. And you start building a whole story around one small piece of information. I've done that. I think a lot of people have. The moment might be over, but your mind keeps working on it. The conversation ended, but you're still answering it. The email has already been sent, but you're still rewriting it in your head, right? The meeting's over, but later that night you finally think of the thing that you wish that you would have said. And you wonder, where was that when I needed it? And there's something about that worth noticing. Sometimes our first response under pressure is not our clearest response. It might just be the response that we've practiced the most. For one person, that response is frustration. For another, it's pulling away. Or for another, it's assuming the worst, right? Or trying to control everything. And then again, for another, it's blaming themselves before they even understand what happened. And because those responses feel familiar, we can start giving them too much authority. We say things like, that's just how I am. I've always been that way, right? I just overthink things. I just get defensive or shut down. And so there might be some honesty in that. And it's good to recognize a pattern, but recognizing a pattern is not the same thing as surrendering to it. There is a big difference between saying this is something that I tend to do and saying this is who I have to be. One gives you awareness and the other puts a ceiling over your growth. And I think that's where people get stuck. Our reaction shows up enough times and we explain it the same way enough times, and eventually we stop questioning it. It becomes normal, right? It becomes familiar. And familiar can start sounding like truth. And that's why reflection matters. Reflection gives us a little room between what happened and what we immediately decided that it meant. It gives us a chance to ask, was that response actually helping me? Was it protecting something? Was it really about this moment? Or was it connected to something that I've been carrying? And those are useful questions. They're not meant to shame us. This isn't about picking apart every thought or beating ourselves up over every single reaction. That would wear anybody out, right? This is about noticing what usually goes unnoticed. Because if we never notice the pattern, we usually keep repeating it. So before we talk about changing a response, we have to notice it. Before we talk about handling pressure better, we have to pay attention to what pressure revealed. And so think back over this past week. Was there a moment where your response told you something? Maybe something frustrated you faster than you expected it to. Maybe something discouraged you more than it should have. Maybe something made you quiet or defensive or irritated or anxious, right? Or even overwhelmed. Don't judge it for a moment. Just notice it. Sometimes clarity begins right there, with enough honesty to say something in me responded quickly there, and I want to understand why. So where do those first responses come from? Because I don't think they come out of nowhere, right? They might feel sudden. They might catch us off guard. They might even show up before we've had time to think clearly. But that doesn't mean that they started in that moment. A lot of the time, pressure doesn't create our response. It just reveals what has already been developing. And so that's an important difference. Because if I think pressure created my response, then I only look at the pressure. I blame the conversation. I blame the deadline, right? I blame the person or the unexpected problem. And sometimes those things really are hard. I'm not trying to minimize that, but if I only look at what happened around me, I might miss what is being revealed inside of me. And that's usually where the growth is. One thing that I've noticed is that our reactions often follow the path that our thinking has already been traveling. We usually don't respond from a thought that we had once, right? We respond from the thought that we've repeated. And that's why reactions feel so natural. They have history. They've been practiced, right? Maybe not on purpose, maybe not out loud, maybe not in any way that we ever even stop to notice, but they have been practiced. And so if somebody has been telling themselves, I always get overlooked, then a small delay can feel personal. If someone has been telling themselves, I had to hold everything together, then one unexpected problem can feel like a threat. Or if somebody has been telling themselves, I can't mess this up, then feedback can feel like failure. And once we expect something long enough, we start looking for evidence of it. And I don't mean that we sit down and decide to do that. It just happens quickly. The mind tends to notice what it has been trained to look for. And so that's why two people can walk into the same situation and experience it completely differently. One person hears feedback, another hears criticism. One person sees a delay and another sees disrespect, right? One person sees a challenge and another sees proof that things never work out, right? Same moment, different filter. And the filter matters because we don't only respond to what happens, we respond to what we believe it means. A comment is just a comment until our mind gives it meaning. A delay is just a delay until our mind turns it into a story. A mistake is just a mistake until our mind starts calling it proof, right? And sometimes the meaning that we attach to something shapes our response more than the thing itself. And that's why our thinking is not just a small thing. It eventually shows up. It shows up in our tone. It shows up in our patience. It shows up in our decisions and how we lead. And it even shows up in what we assume before anybody else even explains themselves. And so have you ever started looking at a certain kind of car and then suddenly you saw that car everywhere? And it wasn't because everyone bought that car overnight, right? It was already there. You just started noticing it. Your attention changed. Your mind had something to look for. And I think that happens internally too. When we keep repeating a thought, our mind starts collecting evidence for it. And if I keep telling myself this week is going to be overwhelming, then I'll probably notice every reason to believe that. If I keep telling myself no one appreciates what I do, then I'm probably going to notice every moment that feels like confirmation. Or how about if I keep telling myself I'm falling behind, then every unfinished task starts feeling like proof. And over time, repeated thoughts become expectations. And expectations have a way of shaping reactions. And so that's why somebody can walk into a meeting already tense before anything has even gone wrong. They already expect conflict. They already expect criticism or expect someone to make things harder. So when something small happens, the response feels bigger than the moment. Because they're not only responding to the moment, they're responding to what their mind had already been rehearsing before the moment arrived. And that's why simply saying, next time I'll do better, usually isn't enough. We might mean it, we might be sincere, but sincerity alone doesn't always change a practice response. If the pattern has been practiced, growth has to be practiced too. A different response begins with a different kind of awareness. Awareness of the thoughts that we've been repeating. Awareness of the stories that we've been carrying. Awareness of the expectations that we bring into situations before they happen. And maybe most importantly, awareness of the meaning that we attach to things. Because sometimes the problem is not only what happened, sometimes it's what our mind immediately decided that it meant. They didn't text back quickly, so it must mean they don't care. Someone gave feedback, so it must mean I'm failing. A plan changed, so it must mean that everything is falling apart. But what if that meaning is not the only possibility, right? What if the first interpretation is not always the most accurate interpretation? What if the first story that our mind tells us is simply the most familiar story? And so that's where clarity starts to show up. When we learn to pause long enough to ask, is this true or is this just familiar? That question can slow a lot down because familiar is not the same thing as true. A familiar thought might feel convincing, a familiar reaction may feel justified, or even a story might feel natural, but that does not mean that it's leading us well. So maybe the deeper question is not only, why did I respond that way? Maybe the better question is, what have I been practicing in my thinking that made that response feel so natural? And so that's not a shame question, it's a clarity question. And once we begin to see the connection between repeated thinking and automatic responses, we gain the ability to interrupt the pattern. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And sometimes growth begins right there. In the moment that we realize this response has a history, but I don't have to keep rehearsing the same one. So think about your phone for a minute. Most of us use our phones every day without thinking much about what is happening behind the scene. You know, we pick it up, we check a message, we answer a call, we open an app, we even look at the calendar, right, and check the weather. And after a while, it just feels automatic. But underneath all of that, there are settings running, notifications, right, alerts, permissions, reminders, default apps, background activity. And some of those settings are helpful. Some of them, though, are distracting. And so some of them that we turn on intentionally, and some of them that we probably turned on a long time ago and we forgot that they were even there. And then one day we realize that the phone has been interrupting us more than helping us. Not because the phone is broken, right? But something in the settings needs attention. And so I think our minds can work that way too. A response shows up quickly. You know, frustration, defensiveness, fear, or discouragement, or avoidance, and overthinking. And because it shows up fast, we assume that's just me. But what if it isn't the whole picture? What if it's just a setting? What if it's a default response that's been running for a long time? What if it's been shaped by something that we experienced? Or what if it's been reinforced by something that we keep telling ourselves? Or what if it helped us in one season, but now it's getting in the way of who we're trying to become? And so that changes how we look at it. If I believe my reaction is just who I am, I'm not going to question it. But if I understand it as a pattern, now I can start asking better questions. Where did this come from? Is it still helping me? Is it leading me well? Is this the response that I want to keep practicing? Those questions create a little space, and sometimes space is exactly what we need. Because without space, we usually react. But with space, we have a chance to choose. Now, I don't want to make that sound easy. Pressure doesn't usually give us a warning. Nobody puts frustration on the calendar, right? Nobody says, at 2:15 today, I'm going to need an extra patience. It usually shows up without much notice. A conversation changes, right? A plan falls apart. Someone misunderstands us. Somebody takes longer than expected, or a commitment hits the wrong place in us. And suddenly, the old response is right there, ready and available and familiar. And that's why the work has to start before the moment. If we wait until pressure hits to think about our response, we're already dealing with the strongest pattern. But when we start paying attention ahead of time, when we notice where our minds tend to go, when we become honest about the stories that we repeat, we give ourselves a better chance. Not a perfect chance, but a better chance. Maybe the old response still shows up, but this time we notice it. Maybe frustration rises, but this time we catch it before it becomes our tone. Maybe defensiveness shows up, right? But this time we recognize it before we stop listening. Maybe discouragement even starts to take over, but this time we ask, is this true or is this just familiar? And that pause might seem small, but a pause can interrupt what used to run automatically. And that's the clarity moment for today. Your first response might be familiar, but familiar does not have to be final. Just because your mind goes somewhere first doesn't mean that it has to stay there. And just because a reaction shows up quickly doesn't mean it gets the lead. You can notice it, you can question it, you can slow it down, and then you can choose what you want to practice next. That's where this gets practical, right? We're not talking about becoming a completely different person overnight. We're talking about noticing the first response and creating enough room to choose the next one. That's self-leadership. Before we can consistently lead a business or a team or a family or even a difficult conversation, we have to learn how to lead our own thinking. And that starts with awareness. And so this week, when that first response shows up, pay attention. Don't rush to shame it, right? Don't rush to excuse it or to obey it. Just notice it. Because the moment that you notice a pattern, you're no longer only inside the pattern, you're beginning to lead it. How do we begin using it? How do we take the idea that familiar doesn't have to be final and carry it into an actual week? Because this is where it matters, right? It has to meet us when the schedule changes, when the conversation gets tense, when the email comes in, when something takes longer than expected, right? When the same old pattern starts showing up again. And I think a good place to begin is by noticing the first signal. Not the whole reaction, just the first signal. Because most reactions don't start at full volume. They usually start small. A little tension in your shoulders, a quick assumption, a change in your tone, a thought that says, here we go again. And so sometimes your body notices the response before your words do. And sometimes your tone changes before you fully admitted that you're bothered. And sometimes your mind starts racing before you even named what you're feeling. And so that's why awareness matters. If we wait until the reaction is already taken over, it's harder to lead it. But if we notice the first signal, we create a little room. And that room can change the moment. Maybe your first signal is frustration. Something takes longer than expected, right? Somebody doesn't respond the way that you hoped, or a plan changes. And right away, your mind says, this always happens. And that might be familiar, but is it true, right? Maybe your first signal is defensiveness. Somebody gives feedback, somebody asks a question, somebody points something out, right? And before you know it, you're not really listening anymore. You're building your case, right? That might be familiar, but is it helping? Or how about maybe your first signal is discouragement? One thing doesn't go the way that you wanted, and your mind starts making it bigger than it is. It stops being one moment, right? It becomes a statement about your whole week, your business, your ability, and your future. And that might be familiar, but should it have that much authority? This is where the work starts, not with trying to fix every response in 1 week, just with noticing sooner. What is my first signal? That's a practical question, right? Because when you know the first signal, you can catch the pattern earlier. And earlier matters. If you notice frustration before it becomes your tone, you can handle the conversation differently. If you notice defensiveness before it becomes your response, you can listen with more clarity. And if you notice discouragement before it becomes your story, you can keep one setback from naming the whole week. And so this is real growth. It might not look dramatic. It might not feel like a big breakthrough, but it does matter. A lot of growth looks ordinary while it's happening. It looks like just pausing before you speak. It looks like slowing down before you assume, right? It looks like asking one better question. And it even looks like choosing not to turn one moment into the whole story. And so over time, those ordinary choices start to shape us because what we practice becomes more available. And if we practice impatience becomes easier to reach for. If we practice avoidance becomes easier to justify. And if we practice assuming becomes easier to believe. But the other direction is true too. If we practice patience becomes more available. If we practice curiosity starts showing up a little sooner. And if we practice responsibility becomes part of how we lead. And so this week, don't try to change everything. Just choose one place to pay attention. Maybe it's how you respond when plans change. Maybe it's how you respond when someone gives feedback. Or maybe it's how you respond when you feel behind. Or it could even be how you respond when somebody disappoints you. Just pick one area though, one pattern, one familiar first response. And when it shows up, ask yourself, what is my mind doing right now? Is it assuming? Is it protecting? Is it exaggerating? Right? Is it rehearsing an old story? Or even trying to control something? That question helps us step back from the reaction long enough to lead it. Because a reaction might be real without being wise. A feeling might be strong without being accurate. Right? A thought might be familiar without being true. And so a first response may show up quickly without deserving the final word. And so that's why this matters in business. It matters in leadership, right? It matters at home and in conversations and when the pressure is high. Because when we don't lead our thinking still leads. It just does it without much resistance from us. So maybe the win this week is simple. You notice sooner. You pause sooner. You catch the old story before it takes over. That's progress. Your first response might reveal what's been familiar, but your next response can begin shaping what becomes possible. Okay, so let's take a sip of our coffee. And let's not rush past this part, right? Because sometimes we hear something that hits close to home, and before it has time to settle, we move on. We do that enough during the week, right? We move from one thing to the next, one conversation, one responsibility, one problem, one decision. But clarity usually needs a little space. And so think back over this past week. Not the whole week, just one moment. Maybe it was a conversation. Maybe it was a delay. Maybe it was something that frustrated you. Maybe it was a change that you didn't expect, right? Maybe it was just one of those moments where nobody else knew what was happening inside of you, but you knew. Your mind went somewhere, right? Your body reacted, your tone changed, your thoughts started moving. That old familiar response showed up again. And so don't judge it right now. Don't defend it. Don't explain it away, right? Just notice it. Ask yourself, what was my first response? Was it frustration? Was it defensiveness? Was it fear, right? Or discouragement or avoidance or overthinking? Was it trying to control the situation, right? Was it assuming the worst? And then ask one more question. What has made that response so familiar to me? Not to shame yourself, just to understand, because understanding gives us a place to begin. And maybe that's enough for this moment, right? You noticed it. That matters because once you notice a pattern, it doesn't get to stay hidden in the same way. And so take another sip. Let's settle that. Your first response might be familiar, but it doesn't have to decide what comes next. So what do we do with this, right? How do we take this conversation and actually carry it into the week? I want to keep this simple. This week, practice noticing your first response. That's it. Notice it before you try to fix it. Notice it before you explain it, right? Notice it before you let it take over. When something interrupts you, notice. When something frustrates you, notice. Or when you feel yourself getting defensive, notice. Or when discouragement starts building a story in your mind, right? Notice that stuff. The goal is not to have perfect reactions. That's not real life. The goal is to catch the response a little sooner than you normally would. Maybe you're in a conversation and you feel your tone start to change. That's the moment to notice. Maybe you read an email and immediately you start assuming what somebody meant. That's the moment to notice, right? Those are the moments. So maybe even you feel behind, before the week even gets going, and your first response is to rush and tense up or mentally shut down. Again, that's the moment to notice. And when you notice it, ask yourself one question. What is my mind doing right now? That question is simple, but it can slow things down. Is my mind assuming, or is it exaggerating or protecting? Is it rehearsing an old story? Is it trying to control something? Right? Is it turning one moment into a bigger conclusion? You might not have the full answer right away, and that's okay. The question itself creates space. And once you have a little space, now you can ask the next question. What do I want to practice next? Maybe you practice taking a breath before answering. Maybe you practice asking one clarifying question instead of assuming the worst. Maybe you practice slowing your words down before frustration becomes your tone, right? Or maybe you practice taking one step towards the conversation that you've been avoiding. Maybe you practice reminding yourself, right? This is one moment. It's not the whole story. That's practical growth. It might not feel dramatic while it's happening. Most real growth doesn't. It often looks like a small pause, right? A quieter tone, a better question, a little more honesty, a little more responsibility, right? A decision not to let an old reaction lead the whole moment, right? And this is where my grit framework becomes very practical. Relentless mindset rewiring helps us notice the thinking that needs to change. And then intentional execution helps us practice a better response. Total accountability helps us to own what is ours to notice and improve. And so don't try to work on everything this week. Just choose one place, one pattern, one familiar first response. Pay attention to it. And when it shows up, ask, what is my mind doing right now? And then ask, what do I want to practice next? That is the practice. Notice the first response. Pause long enough to understand it, and then choose what you want to practice next. Not perfectly, but intentionally. Because every single time you notice a familiar pattern and choose a better response, you're training your mind for the next moment. And so now as we close this morning, I want to come back to the thought that we've been carrying. Your first response might be familiar, but familiar does not have to be final, right? That's worth taking into the week, because at some point this week, you're probably going to have a moment, right? A conversation or a delay or a frustration, a change that you didn't expect. Something will happen and your mind might go to a familiar place. And when it does, I hope that you remember this, not so that you can criticize yourself, not so that you can overthink every single reaction, just so that you can notice, because noticing is where the pattern starts to lose some of its control. You might not catch it every single time. You might not respond perfectly, but even noticing it sooner is growth. Maybe you'll pause before answering. Maybe you'll ask a better question. Maybe you'll slow your tone down. Maybe you'll just realize the story your mind is building is not the only possible story. And that matters, right? Because the responses we practice shape the people that we become. And so don't try to change everything this week. Just notice sooner. Pause a little longer. Ask, what is my mind doing right now? And then ask, what do I want to practice next? You've been listening to the Coffee and Clarity Show. I'm Stephen Briggs, and I'm grateful that you spent part of your day with me. And as you step into this week, carry this question with you. What am I telling myself right now? And finally, think about what you think about, because you're always moving in the direction of your mind's most dominant thoughts. Have a great week.